Hi, the SI meteorologist Paul Dorian here. Well, we're approaching the end of the month of September. I thought it would be a good time to do a global sea ice update. In general, the northern hemisphere sea ice aerial extent is still running at below normal levels, although it's considerably higher than it was a year ago and is running higher than several of the most recent years. Meanwhile, the southern hemisphere is running at above normal levels, and globally speaking, it's relatively close to normal for this time of the year. Well, one of the things I want to talk about right up front is an oceanic cycle. It takes place in the Atlantic Ocean, specifically the sea surface temperatures in the North Atlantic. That's tracked through an index that meteorologists use called the Atlantic Multidecadal Oscillation, or AMO for short. It seems to have a direct correlation on what's going on in terms of the northern hemisphere sea ice. This is a plot going way back in time of the AMO index that again represents in general the sea surface temperatures in the North Atlantic. And main thing I want to point out here is notice right in this time period right here, right around the mid 1990s, about 1995 or so, there was a flip in the pattern from a blue indicated on this particular chart, or a negative cooler than normal sea surface temperatures, to above normal, or what's indicated here in red. Right around mid-1990s, this phase in the northern Atlantic sea surface temperature pattern flipped from a negative or cooler than normal to a positive and warmer than normal. And keep this date in mind here, right around 1995 or so, because that, again, I believe has a high correlation to what's going on in the northern hemisphere with respect to sea ice, and we'll focus in on that over the next several minutes. Now notice again from 1995 all the way back into about the 1960s, we had a negative phase, or a cooler than normal phase, in the North Atlantic. And since 1995, in general, it's been above normal with respect to sea surface temperatures in the North Atlantic. Well, here's a plot of the Northern Hemisphere sea ice anomaly from the University of Illinois Cryosphere website, which is an excellent website, by the way, at below normal levels right here. But one of the things I wanted to point out is a couple of different trends that seem to be, again, correlated with that AMO, the Atlantic Multidecadal Oscillation. Notice here, right around this time frame right here, this is about 1995, there's generally a sideways and above normal, this is a normal value right here of 0, generally a sideways and above normal trend to right around 1995 or so when the AMO flipped. And after that, generally a downward trend in sea ice aerial extent in the northern hemisphere. So again, seems to be a pretty decent correlation here with what's going on in terms of sea surface temperatures in the North Atlantic, which we track through the AMO index, with the pre-1995 readings at above normal and kind of a sideways trend, and then a downward trend in the sea ice aerial extent after about 1995 or so. Now here's a plot also from the University of Illinois Cryosphere website, which shows the Northern Hemisphere sea ice aerial extent for the day of the year, which rides along the x-axis here. This is all for 2013, and the yellow right here represents where we stand right at the moment here for 2013. And this is being compared to all these years going back to the beginning of the satellite era, 1979. And again, compared to a year ago, which is this right here, this is 2012, there's been a significant increase. Not too hard to do considering that a year ago was really at a record low. However, it's significant in that the trend is certainly up compared to a year ago, and in fact, the aerial extent in the northern hemisphere is above several of the recent years. Most of these years date back to the most recent time frame, but it's ahead of the game for compared to 2007, 2008, 2010, 2011, and a year ago it's considerably higher than that, but still below normal and still not quite in the middle of the pack. It's now, by the way, kind of reached its low point of the year. It looks like it will track on up. But again, another main point I want to make here is it seems to be well correlated with the North Atlantic sea surface temperature oceanic cycle that we track through the AMO index. And as long as that index remains positive or warmer than normal sea surface temperatures, I would expect the sea ice here in the northern hemisphere to stay at below normal levels. But once that flips, perhaps 5 or 10 years or so, I would expect that this would climb to normal or above normal levels, such as it was in the pre-1995 era, as we saw a moment ago. One of the reasons why the Northern Hemisphere sea ice seems to have gained quite a bit of aerial extent compared to a year ago is the fact that this summer was really one of the coldest summers in a long time, as measured by the Danish Meteorological Institute. We have shown this particular map before, and this shows the running daily mean temperature from 80 degrees north on northward to the actual North Pole. And notice here, the red here indicates the actual temperatures going across each day of the year. This is 2013 on a daily basis here on the x-axis. So the red here represents the actual daily mean temperatures in and around the North Pole, compared to the green, which represents the climatological mean going back several decades. So basically throughout the summer months, which is in this region right here, the actual temperature in and around the North Pole was below normal, and that has not happened all that often going back 50 years or so, according to the data from the DMI, the Danish Meteorological Institute. It ran at below normal levels just about the entire summer. Now, in the last week or two, there's been an above normal reading here, but this line right up in this region right here represents the freezing line. So while it's above normal temperatures right now in and around the North Pole, the Arctic sea ice will continue to increase since it's below freezing right now, and will stay that way for the next several months. So again, this is kind of an explanation as to why the Arctic sea ice may have increased. A cold summer up there with below normal readings pretty much each and every day throughout the summer months. Well, so far we've focused on sea ice aerial extent, but another parameter that's very important as well with respect to sea ice is the volume. Aerial extent is easier to measure using satellite observations from above, and volume is certainly much more difficult to measure given that it's below the surface. And in fact, there are no direct measurements of Arctic sea ice or sea ice volume or Antarctic sea ice volume, but there is a model that can estimate the sea ice volume produced by the University of Washington, the Polar Solar Center. It's a model called the PIOMAS, which stands for the Pan-Arctic Ice Ocean Modeling and Assimilation System, and its results are shown here going back all the way to the beginning of the satellite era observations, again, 1979. Now, they have a trend line on here, and in the big picture, going back to the late 1970s, indeed, there's a downward trend in the sea ice volume to below normal levels. But if you look closely at it, I believe there are really two trend lines here that kind of correlate, again, to what we were talking about up front, the Atlantic multidecadal oscillation, in that in the pre-1995 era, right about in this region right here, is where the AMO flipped. Really have this sideways above normal trend line going right in this time period, and then following the flip in the AMO right in the middle 1990s, you have this downward trend. So one point I want to make here is that the trend lines here seem to mimic what's going on in terms of aerial extent. And again, this is volume, estimated volume, using this PIOMAS model developed by the University of Washington. So again, long term there is a downward trend, no doubt, but if you break this down, I think it shows a pretty good correlation with the oceanic cycle in the North Atlantic, specifically the sea surface temperatures, with an above normal, here's normal here, an above normal sideways trend similar to the aerial extent trend, and then after the AMO flipped, a downward trend. And again, I believe that these kind of oceanic cycles can last for a couple of decades or so, and when the AMO flips again, and it will, perhaps 5 or 10 years from now, the Northern Hemisphere sea ice will end up getting to normal and above normal levels, just like it was pre-1995. Well, in terms of the Southern Hemisphere sea ice anomaly, this is going back to a chart from the University of Illinois again. Above normal readings right now. There's really been kind of a a trend in recent weeks to higher and higher above normal. But not really too many distinctive type trends going all the way back to the 1979s. It's generally kind of bounced around the normal level, and again, above normal right now. And perhaps when the AMO flips and the Northern Hemisphere gets back to above normal levels in 5 or 10 years or so, as I believe it will, the Southern Hemisphere may go back in the other direction. These kind of natural variations are pretty common, especially with respect to oceanic cycles. So again, the Southern Hemisphere is running at above normal levels, and many particular days earlier this summer and earlier this year, it was actually at record high levels for that particular day of the year. And here is, in fact, the Southern Hemisphere sea ice aerial extent compared to other years going back to about 1979, the beginning of the satellite era, presented right here by the yellow line right here. It's at the top of the pack, above normal, higher than most years going back to 1979. And again, we have each day of the year going on the x-axis here for 2013. And on some days, like right on this particular day, for example, the yellow line was at the highest ever going back to 1979. In other words, record sea ice on that particular day. So again, the Southern Hemisphere sea ice aerial extent is well above normal and well above most years going back to the beginning of the satellite era observations. So that's it for now with a global sea ice update. The Northern Hemisphere continues to run at below normal levels, but considerably higher than a year ago and higher than several recent years. Southern Hemisphere continues to run at well above normal levels. It appears as if the Northern Hemisphere sea ice is correlated quite well with the AMO, the Atlantic Multidecadal Oscillation, that is currently in a warmer than normal sea surface temperature phase. And again, it seems to have flipped in the mid-1990s, and that correlates quite well with when the Northern Hemisphere sea ice changed from above normal readings to a downward trend and below normal. So that's it for now. We'll continue to monitor this over the weeks and months to come here at the SIweather.com. I'm the SI meteorologist, Paul Dorian.